Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. With Canada participating in Philippine military drills and racking up transits of the Taiwan Strait, is Ottawa emerging as a key player in the Indo-Pacific? With me to discuss this are Stephen Nagy, Japan Institute for International Affairs Visiting Fellow, and MacDonald Laurier Institute Senior Fellow, and he's visiting from Japan. And Vincent Chao, Taipei City Councilor of the Democratic Progressive Party. Stephen, Vincent, very warm welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Canada launched its Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022, following about a dozen other countries which took their lead from the US and Australia in 2017. As a Pacific country like the United States, Canada shares 25,000 kilometres of Pacific coastline. Ottawa acknowledges the Indo-Pacific region will play a critical role in shaping the future of Canada over the next half-century. Stephen, let me come to you first. So Canada has said that the Philippines is a major partner for it in the Indo-Pacific, and it's delivered on that partnership by allowing Manila use of something called a dark vessel detection system. Can you tell us, what are dark vessels and why is this important to the Philippines?
Well, dark vessels are basically I'm going to put this in the context of China. It's Chinese ships that have turned off their GPS devices, so they can kind of move through the South China Sea without being transparent. And it's a way to try and press their territorial claims and their dominance within the South China Sea. And Canada and other like-minded countries like Japan or South Korea or Australia are looking at how they can help the Philippines detect these ships so they can better secure their territories as China presses forward in terms of trying to dominate the region. Mm-hmm. So it gives them the ability to try to track these vessels where it would be much more difficult without these technologies.
Mm. And Vincent, so how would you say that allowing Manila use of this does feed into Canada's own goals for the Indo-Pacific?
I think it shows that Canada is willing to play a stronger and larger role in ensuring stability in the South China Sea. And I think Canada has always been a big proponent of transparency. I mean, transparency adherence to international law, international norms, and I think supporting Manila in tracking these vessels, which are mainly from, Chinese maritime militia, and have eroded not only the Philippines' maritime interests, but also international law and stability in the region, I think have been a focal point of Ottawa's efforts to fight back against it. So I do think it's a good measure. I think time will tell on whether it's successful or not and how effectively Manila is able to utilize these technologies to respond. But certainly I do think it is a welcome measure by many countries here in the region.
Mm. So Stephen, let's talk more broadly then about Ottawa's Indo-Pacific strategy, its ambitions in the region. And we've mentioned China. Does it help to view the development of this strategy in the light of Canadian-Chinese relations?
Well, I think first and foremost, Canada and its Indo-Pacific strategy has really highlighted the fact that China is a disruptive power. And what it means by that, and Vincent mentioned this, is that it's pushing the boundaries of international law, if not obeying international law. And the peace and stability in this entire region is really based on this idea that all the countries follow international law. And the consequences of not following international law or engaging in dark vessel maneuvers through the South China Sea or ignoring things like the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration decision against China is that it creates intense instability. And through the South China Sea and in and around Taiwan where we're sitting, about $5.5 trillion of trade go through these sea lines of communication. And the concern from Ottawa's point of view is that a disruption in these sea lines of communication will not have only a disruption in the regional economy, but the global economy, and this will affect Canadians. Mm-hmm. So they want to invest in rule of law, they want to invest in partnerships with countries like the Philippines and places like Taiwan to ensure that they're stable, they're peaceful, and they're contributing to a rules-based order within this region. And it's really critical from this economic standpoint.
Mm. Vincent, let's take a look at what the 2023 strategy says about China, the actual words. It says, China's rise as a global actor is reshaping the strategic outlook of every state in the region, including Canada. China has benefited from the rules-based international order to grow and prosper, but it is now actively seeking to reinterpret these rules to gain greater advantage. China's assertive advancement of unilateral claims, foreign interference, and increasingly coercive treatment of other countries and economies have significant implications in the region, in Canada and around the world. Let's talk a bit about the coercive actions directed at Canada.
Yeah, well, I'll first say when the strategy came out last year, I think many people saw it as a sign of breath of fresh air, a sign of clarity. And I think it did clarify many of facets of Canada's relationship with China that people had, not only sort of seen that were unclear in the past, but also seen to this fact that economic measures may have dominated more political concerns. And I think this Indo-Pacific strategy sort of upended those doubts and concerns because it was very clear. I mean, it talked about China being coercive, assertive, it talked about China being disruptive, and there was a clear policy formulation in terms of how Canada was going to deal with all of these measures. And we talked about the dark vessel monitoring program, but we haven't talked about transits yet. And transits are another very, very strong indicator that Canada is prepared to put actions behind their words, and that they've, for example, in September this year, worked with the United States to send ships across the Taiwan Strait. And I thought what was especially striking about that transit was the fact that they had a CBC news crew on board.
Right.
And the CBC news crew basically had first-hand reporting about these 3 Chinese vessels that were tailing them the whole way through, including this guided missile destroyer. That was actually quite provocative in a sense because this was international waters. And so I do think Canada is showing that it is prepared to do it more. Now, obviously, as Stephen said, all of this is absolutely consistent with Canadian national interests, and I think that is the guiding mantra of this Indo-Pacific strategy we see.
And maybe taking a leaf out the Philippines book in terms of that sort of assertive transparency, the broadcasting, taking along journalists and cameramen and showing to the world what China is doing in terms of that grey zone warfare. Stephen, let's talk about some of the election interfering. Let's talk about the Canadian consul being expelled, some of these, and obviously Huawei as the backdrop to China's China and Canada relations.
Well, I think, again, as we're thinking about China-Canada relations, we need to think about it through the lenses of trade. We have a positive trade relationship, and it's continued to be positive despite the anti-China rhetoric, despite the COVID pandemic. But we have deep concerns about allegations about electoral interference, and I think importantly, threats against Canadian parliamentarians like Michael Chung and his family in mainland China. And this has raised the specter that China is interfering, of course, in our elections and affecting how Canadian Chinese are participating in our free and open democratic system. And this is of deep concern. Canada's a rule-of-law country, we're a multicultural country, and we want to make sure that all our citizens, whether they're black, white, Chinese, Japanese, Hungarian, or whatever, are participating as full citizens and contributing to a vibrant democracy. And we're very concerned about this electoral interference. And there's growing evidence that it's impacting our voting patterns, it's impacting who's in power and our approach. And I think the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy is really trying to put up a bulwark so we can prevent this kind of electoral interference, not only unilaterally, but I think working with our partners within the region, because they're all facing the same problem.
So what's behind the electoral interference? What does China seek to do?
They seek to change the voting patterns of Canadians so that we vote for leadership that is willing or not as willing to put up with China's behavior. And I think that this is a real problem, whether we're talking about human rights issues, whether we're talking about very active involvement in the Indo-Pacific, or whether we're sending ships into the midline area between Taiwan and China. Canada wants to ensure that the rules-based order is upheld, because what happens in this region will eventually spill over into Canada if we're not defending the region and defending our partners.
Vincent, the Huawei incident, this ended up being the detention of 2 Canadians, the 2 Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Tell us a bit about how this was linked to Huawei.
So I actually had an opportunity to meet one of the Michaels, Michael Kovrig, in the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, and we had a pretty frank discussion. And I think, the fact that he's released today and he has no charges that have stuck onto him, showed that it was a political ploy by the Chinese to gain political leverage against Canada. And it was a despicable effort to really use human hostages to gain diplomatic leverage. But I think it's just within the norms of everything Stephen was talking about earlier and what the Chinese are doing across the region today. We also have to understand that there is no concept of like liberal Western democracy in China. It's actually completely antithesis, but it's to what the CCP stands for. But they view it as actually an ideal platform to work through different levers to try to manipulate public opinion through, for example, voting patterns, but also through disinformation and so forth. And this is exactly what we see here in Taiwan. Now, I do think that Canada has taken quite a principled stand against Huawei, and it was very much a case of David versus the Goliath. I mean, China, I think, threw an outburst over that, and but ultimately Canada didn't back down, and Canada stuck with its rule of law, and I think it allowed the charges as well as the allegations, as well as the extradition process to proceed as was lawfully necessary. So, to its credit, I think Canada showed a lot of backbone throughout the process, and I think showing this sort of backbone and consistency is ultimately how you make the PRC pay you a little bit of respect in this diplomatic process.
Stephen, let's talk about the relationship between Canada and Taiwan. We've mentioned, Vincent mentioned the transits, and Canada has notched up the greatest number, I understand, since 2021 of accompanying the US on their freedom of navigation operations in contested waters. There were 4 times now the Canadians have sailed alongside the US. Also, Canada has recently completed negotiations with Taiwan for the investment pact. How significant is this?
Well, I think that Canada looks at Taiwan's position and the importance of Taiwan in these sea lines of communication and as a bulwark of democracy within the Indo-Pacific region as a really important, canary in the coal mine of where the region's going to go. And if Taiwan falls, if Taiwan is falls to prey of an authoritarian state, that this will affect the broader region's stability. And Canada can't do this alone. This is why it's working with the United States and it's working with other partners to strengthen Taiwan's democracy, to try and contribute to its good governance, to try and form the kinds of non-state relationships that fit within Canada's One China policy. And that's really important. It's not China's One China policy, it's Canada's One China policy, to ensure that Taiwan does remain free and the status quo remains intact and peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits remains intact. And Canada's going to continue to do this. And I think that they're trying to find, and they have already implementing innovative ways to work with Taiwan. So in our Indo-Pacific strategy, working with Taiwan, New Zealand, and Australia, they're working on indigenous issues and they're working on environmental issues. And again, they see these as net positives that reflect Canadian interests domestically, but how Taiwan can contribute to these issues at the international level. And I think we're going to see these kinds of policies continue. But they're also going to be reflected in other countries' engagements with Taiwan, because I think many countries see working with Taiwan as an important part of their own Indo-Pacific strategy, their own interests. But again, this idea that what happens to Taiwan matters not just to Canadians, but to other countries as well.
Vincent, the agreement that is yet to be signed, the FIPA, the investment agreement. I just want to quote from you what's been said about that. It's a comprehensive investment protection norms. It incorporates this and restricts the host country from imposing additional investment restrictions beyond what has been mutually agreed to ensure investors enjoy a predictable and stable investment environment. Does this provide a contrast to perhaps Canadian investors or businesses in China?
Well, I know that Canada has pursued an FTA with China in years past, and I think those hopes were dashed a number of years ago. I think obviously the Huawei case contributed to the breakdown of relations following the arbitrary detention of the 2 Michaels and so forth. And I think Canada, since then, I mean, what we've seen publicly is they've reoriented sort of away from that priority. And so it's actually worth saying that this is not the first economic agreement we've signed with Canada. The double taxation agreement has been in place for a number of years now. Now, FIPA, we finished the negotiations. Now, obviously, there's a ratification process that needs to be undergone for that. But it's actually a very strong agreement. I mean, it includes about 70 articles, everything from achieving net zero carbon emissions to labor rights, human rights, and so forth. And I think it's quite comprehensive in a way that it will deliver sort of the aims that you talked about, Yun, which includes, for example, stability in investment environments, investor protection, dispute settlement clauses, and so forth. So I do think it will bring Canada and Taiwan closer together in terms of that investment. And I do think that there are a number of very high-profile investments from Taiwan to Canada right now. For example, TSMC has a research and development facility in Ottawa, and I think it will strengthen these sorts of exchanges to the benefit of both countries. So I'm quite optimistic in what it will lead to.
Great, okay, thank you. Now, in tandem with China's increasingly assertive territorial claims in the South and East China Seas, and of course the Taiwan Strait, is Beijing's drive to modernize its military. The US recently released a report into China's military capabilities. I spoke to Zack Cooper, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, to find out more.
For many years, China had just a couple hundred nuclear warheads that were deployed, and now it's building a very substantial triad of nuclear capabilities. Long-range bombers with nuclear-capable cruise missiles, more advanced nuclear ballistic submarines, and then increasingly several hundred ICBM silos that will hold ballistic missiles out to the west. And so this is a really serious nuclear buildup. It's clearly not a minimal nuclear force. I think it's actually a sprint towards parity or something close to parity with the United States and Russia.
And what does that mean in terms of a Taiwan contingency?
The real challenge there is that it may make China more confident that it can use its conventional capabilities, its conventional military, to push around not just Taiwan, but the United States or Japan, because the threat of nuclear retaliation from the United States is going to be a little bit more difficult if China has a much more secure second strike capability. And as long as this buildup continues, it could increase also in the future. So this is a major strategic change.
Another aspect of the report that some analysts found alarming, they didn't know that China was already or had already armed their submarines with missiles capable of 10,000 kilometers range. Is this correct? And again, what's the significance of this?
Well, the significance is that for a long time, China's ballistic nuclear navy would have to actually go closer to Hawaii to hit the United States. So the challenge for China was that you had these relatively loud ballistic missile submarines that would have to go not just through the first island chain, but deep into the Western Pacific to be able to launch against targets in the continental United States. Now, increasingly, China is going to have the ability to launch those missiles from much closer to China's shores. So the challenge here is really that it's going to make it more difficult for the United States to be confident that it can bottle up Chinese ballistic missile submarines inside the first island chain in the East China Sea or the South China Sea or the Yellow Sea.
And do you think, Zack, that sort of capability creates the deterrence that could prevent America from entering any sort of Taiwan contingency?
I don't think it will deter the United States from entering a contingency if one were to occur, but I do think the Chinese may believe it would prevent the United States from entering, and we have to do everything possible to make sure that Beijing understands that, yes, China has a more advanced nuclear capability, but the United States still has its commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act and a desire to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and that we will use force if necessary to do that.
And Zack, do you think public opinion in the US, though, is behind that?
A few years ago, if you asked that question, something like 35% of Americans would have said that the US should send our troops to help protect Taiwan. Now those numbers are creeping up. They're over 50%, even closer to 60% more recently. So I think you're seeing a real shift, an increase in support of the willingness of the American people to help Taiwan in a crisis. But I'll be candid, these numbers can change quickly. And I think a lot will depend on a perception that Taiwan is doing everything it can to protect itself. This is really one of the things that was vital in Ukraine.
That was security analyst Zack Cooper speaking to me earlier. Stephen, returning to Canada.
Sure.
So you've written about how Canada's foreign policy's global position is in crisis and that it requires a reset. Why do you say that?
Absolutely, and if you look at its relations with China, it's in deep trouble. Its relationships with India is fractured because of the allegations of the Indian involvement in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. And the reality in 2024, we may have a new American president that is unorthodox and rather against this idea of a rules-based order. And for Canada, again, Canada's thinking, and as a middle power, is that it requires rules, it requires stable relations, and it requires engagement at the diplomatic level with partners like the United States. And these three partners are arguably the most important for Canada and its economy, and it needs to stabilize these relations. And I say that it's in crisis because I think it really needs to rethink its middle power identity to be much more pragmatic, interest-based, and realistic in what Canada can do in terms of its limited resources. And here I think its engagement with Taiwan is an excellent example, whether it's FIPA in terms of a trade agreement or concentrating on Indigenous and environmental issues. You have to concentrate your resources to have sustainable and meaningful diplomacy, and I think we need a lot more of that in Canadian foreign policy rather than spreading the peanut butter much too thin. And I think this is a challenge where we are in Canada's foreign policy.
So thinking about the Indo-Pacific, is your point that it needs to be less ambitious?
I think it needs to be more focused. It needs to build strong partnerships with countries like Japan, South Korea, political entities like Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and concentrate resources there so it can, again, create that sustainable, meaningful diplomatic momentum and then build from there. And I think that it's going to require partnerships with those like-minded countries before it starts engaging broadly in the region.
Stephen, I mean, sort of delving deeper into what you have written, though, you've talked about maybe less focusing on these norms and these values and sort of taking I suppose it's a more strategic approach, sort of like choosing which issues to align to. Is that a correct reading?
So I say an interest-based approach is that I think if we're working with Taiwan, democracy and human rights can be definitely forefront. Taiwan is a bastion of human rights and democracy and freedom of press. But if we want to have a partnership with Vietnam, we want to have a partnership with other countries, maybe focusing on good governance rather than democracy and human rights is a better approach to ensure that we have an inclusive, non-judgmental approach to building these broad partnerships within the region. So it's a choice of vocabulary and how we prioritize these core values in our foreign policy. And if we do have a very value-based approach broadly to the region, I think we'll exclude important partners that we need to create a rules-based order within this region. And again, whether it's Singapore or Vietnam or India or Indonesia, Philippines, they all require a tailored approach and a value, democracy first, human rights first approach. Although it's great for Canada and great for Taiwan-Canada relations, it may not be the best approach for the broader region.
I see. And let's go to India now. So Vincent, you know, this was it was an explosive allegation. The evidence is, I believe, it's still being gathered to be presented. How does India-Canada relations? How does it impact Canada's standing in the Indo-Pacific, given it's the second most populous country by 2030, it will be the most populous?
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me the easy question, by the way. No, I will say this. I mean, Canada has put forward very, very serious allegations against India, that India's government was either supportive or complicit in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. I mean, no country would take that as an affront to their sovereignty. And so I think by putting it out there, I would assume at some point that people within Canada have a high degree of confidence in sort of these allegations. But I think ultimately it is a judicial matter at this point. And I think the facts have to speak for themselves. And I do hope and expect that Canada will be open and transparent, as it should, in terms of its allegations that have been made. Now, India, I think, is obviously a very touchy subject, not only for Canada, but also for the United States and for all like-minded countries because of its important role in the Pacific region, but also because it's a bulwark against Chinese CCP expansionism in the region. And I do think that Canada has to play a very sensitive and difficult and challenging game in this respect, managing judicial expectations, rule of law, democracy on one hand, but also its far-reaching and some would say the ambitious relationship with India on the other.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, how could Justin Trudeau have handled this better if he could have?
Well, I think in the big picture, Prime Minister Trudeau was often seen as weak or perhaps not as forward-leaning as they could have been on foreign policy, whether it is the allegations about Chinese electoral interference or not defending the allegations about threats to Canadian parliamentarians. And I think he felt that he needed to put this out there to change that narrative that he was a strong leader on these issues. Again, as Vincent said, we'll have to wait for the judicial process to unfold and see where we are. But in speaking to diplomats, and both on the Indian side and on the Canadian side, there's real clear interest in sweeping this under the table, moving forward in the relationship, and trying to build on the comparative advantages that both countries have. This is in neither country's interest in terms of letting this wound fester. And again, they want to get back on the table. They want to sign an FTA. They want to keep the people moving between the two countries. Because again, from Canada's point of view, there's no real Indo-Pacific pivot unless India is part of that package. And I think from India's point of view, they want to be broadly accepted and have legitimacy in the international community. And that means issues such as this allegation need to be dealt with in a more diplomatic, perhaps behind closed doors manner to, again, deal with the complexities of this issue, but at the same time ensure that the partnership can move forward.
I see. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'm sorry. Stephen, Nagy and Vincent Chao, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.